Do you know what happens when you stop the wrong person at the wrong time? The question lingered in the cold air as flashing red and blue lights painted the empty street in restless streaks. The kind of late-night silence where every sound feels louder and every decision feels heavier. And standing under a flickering street lamp was Officer Daniel Brooks, shoulders squared, authority radiating from the badge on his chest. Eyes locked on a lone figure walking steadily along the sidewalk as if the world around her didn't matter, as if the hour didn't matter, as if he didn't matter. And that alone was enough to make him step forward, voice sharp, cutting through the quiet, telling her to stop, to turn, to explain herself, because in his mind nothing about her presence made sense, not at this hour, not in this part of town, not with the calm way she carried herself like she belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And when she finally turned to face him, there was no fear in her expression, no panic, just a steady gaze that held his for a fraction too long, a gaze that didn't match the story he had already decided about her. And still he moved closer, questioning, pressing, letting his assumptions fill the silence between them as the distant hum of the city faded into the background. And she answered simply, quietly, offering nothing more than necessary, her voice even, controlled, as if every word was measured before it left her lips. And that calm only seemed to frustrate him more, because he expected resistance or confusion or something he could push against. But instead there was stillness, a quiet confidence that made the moment stretch longer than it should have. And for a brief second, just a second, something in the air shifted, something unspoken, like the feeling you get when a storm is about to break, but you can't yet see the clouds. And if you were standing there, you might have noticed the small details, the way her posture never faltered, the faint glint of something on her wrist catching the streetlight, the kind of detail most people would overlook, but not the kind that disappears by accident. And Brooks didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to, because he was already too far into the role he believed he owned, already convinced that this was just another routine stop, another moment where he controlled the outcome, where nothing unexpected could happen. And yet the silence between them kept growing heavier, pressing in from all sides, as if the night itself was waiting, watching, holding its breath for what would come next. Because some encounters don't announce their importance. They don't warn you when everything is about to change. They just begin quietly, in the middle of an ordinary moment. And by the time you realize what you've stepped into, it's already too late to step back. The silence did not break. It thickened, settling between them like something alive as Daniel Brooks shifted his stance, the faint crackle of his radio filling the space for a moment before fading again into static. And there was something about the way the woman stood there that refused to match the narrative already forming in his mind, because she was not defensive, not hurried, not uncertain. And in his experience, people who had nothing to hide usually tried harder to prove it. They talked too much, moved too fast, filled the air with explanations. But she did none of that. She simply watched him, her breathing steady, her expression unreadable, as if she had seen this moment before and already knew how it would end. And that calm began to press against him in a way he could not quite explain, like a quiet challenge he had not agreed to accept, but could not ignore either. So he asked more questions, sharper this time, demanding identification, asking where she was coming from, what she was doing out here alone at this hour, his tone carrying the weight of assumption even when his words did not say it outright. And she answered again with the same measured restraint, giving only what was necessary, her voice low but clear, never rising, never breaking. And when she reached slowly into her coat to retrieve her identification, there was a brief flicker of tension in the air, the kind that makes time stretch thin. But her movements were deliberate, controlled, almost practiced, and she handed it over without hesitation. Her fingers steady despite the chill in the night air, and Brooks took it, glancing down under the harsh glow of the streetlight, expecting something ordinary, something that confirmed what he already believed. But instead he found very little, a name, Ava Carter, and not much else that explained the presence. No immediate reason, no obvious context, just enough to keep the question open. And that lack of clarity only seemed to push him further, because uncertainty was not something he liked to sit with. It was something he tried to resolve, to control, to define. And so he stepped closer again, his voice tightening, pressing her for more, telling her that this situation was not adding up, that she needed to explain herself more clearly. And still she did not react the way he expected. She did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not try to walk away. She simply held his gaze. And for the first time, there was the faintest shift in her expression. Not fear, not anger, but something quieter, something almost like patience, as if she were waiting for a moment he could not yet see. And if you were standing there, you might have noticed it too. The way the night felt heavier, the way the distant hum of traffic seemed to fade further away, the way even the flickering streetlight above them seemed to hesitate between pulses, because moments like this do not escalate with noise, they build in silence, layer by layer, until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. And Brooks, without realizing it, had already stepped into something far larger than a routine stop, something that did not follow the rules he thought he understood, and somewhere beyond the edge of the street, beyond the reach of that dim light, something unseen was already moving, already closing the distance, already turning this quiet encounter into the beginning of a consequence he could not yet imagine. The weight of the moment did not explode. It deepened, pressing into the quiet space between them as Daniel Brooks studied the name again, Ava Carter, letting it sit on his tongue for a second longer than necessary, as if repeating it in his mind would unlock something he was missing, but nothing came. No recognition, no immediate authority, just a name that refused to explain the calm standing in front of him, and that absence of answers only sharpened his tone, because control thrives on certainty, and he could feel it slipping just slightly through his fingers. So he handed the identification back with a slower motion than before, his eyes narrowing, searching her face for something that would confirm what he believed, something that would make this simple again, but she gave him nothing, except that same steady gaze, unshaken, unhurried, as if the passing seconds did not belong to him. And then there was a sound, faint at first, so distant it could have been mistaken for nothing more than the night shifting, but it lingered, low and consistent, like a vibration carried through the air rather than heard outright, and Brooks barely noticed it, his attention still locked on the woman in front of him, still trying to force the moment into something familiar, asking another question, more pointed now, telling her that situations like this did not resolve themselves without cooperation, that she needed to understand how this looked, how this felt from his side, and for the first time she responded with something slightly different, not louder, not sharper, but clearer, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that cut through the tension without effort, telling him that she understood exactly how it looked, and that he should consider how it would look later. And the words hung there, simple but weighted, and for a brief moment something flickered behind his expression, not doubt exactly, but a pause, the kind that comes when a thought begins to form before being pushed aside, because he was not used to being the one questioned, not even indirectly. And so he straightened, reinforcing his stance, grounding himself in the authority he knew, the badge, the uniform, the structure that had always placed him in control of moments like this. But the night did not respond. The way it usually did, it did not bend, it did not settle. Instead it seemed to hold its breath, stretching thinner, tighter, until even the smallest sound became impossible to ignore, and that distant vibration grew just enough to register now, a low hum threading through the stillness. And if you were standing there, you might have felt it too, not just heard it, a subtle shift that made the air feel different, heavier, as if something larger was approaching without needing to announce itself. And Ava Carter did not move, did not turn, did not acknowledge it, which somehow made it more noticeable, because it suggested that whatever was coming was not a surprise to her, not an interruption, but something expected, something already accounted for. And Brooks, without fully understanding why, felt the first real fracture in his certainty, small but undeniable, like the moment a quiet room changes before the door even opens. And in that space between what he believed and what he could not yet see, the balance of the encounter began to shift, not with noise, not with force, but with something far more unsettling, the slow realization that he was no longer the one controlling how this would end. The sound did not rush in. It arrived with quiet authority, growing from a distant hum into something unmistakable, something deliberate, and Daniel Brooks felt it before he fully processed it. A subtle vibration under his feet, a shift in the air that no longer belonged to him, and his attention broke for just a second, just long enough for his instincts to pull his gaze past Ava Carter, and into the darkness beyond the reach of the streetlight, where faint outlines began to take shape. Not chaotic, not uncertain, but precise, controlled, moving with a rhythm that did not match the randomness of the night. And in that moment, the certainty he had been holding on to began to slip further, because nothing about what was approaching felt ordinary. Nothing about it felt like something he could command or redirect, and yet he straightened again, trying to reclaim the ground he felt shifting beneath him, telling himself this was still his stop, his call, his situation to manage. But the night did not respond the way it had before. It no longer echoed his authority. It no longer bent to his voice. Instead, it seemed to widen, making space for something else to enter, something that carried its own weight without needing to announce it. And Ava remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, as if the moment unfolding around them had already been accounted for, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond his reach. And that realization, quiet as it was, pressed deeper than any raised voice ever could, because it did not confront him directly. It simply replaced him. And the vehicles came into view now, dark shapes gliding into the edge of the light, engines low, controlled, stopping with a precision that spoke of coordination rather than coincidence, and doors opened not with urgency, but with purpose, measured movements, synchronized steps, and figures emerged one by one, their presence filling the space without a single word spoken. And Brooks felt it then, the undeniable shift, the moment when the balance he thought he held tipped completely out of his hands, not with force, not with confrontation, but with the quiet arrival of something greater than his understanding. And for the first time since the encounter began, he hesitated, just a fraction, just enough for the doubt he had been pushing aside to surface, because nothing about this felt like backup, nothing about this felt like routine. And when one of the figures stepped forward into the light, posture firm, gaze direct, the silence that followed was not empty, it was charged, carrying the weight of authority that did not need to be explained. And Ava finally moved, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just a slight shift of her shoulders, as if acknowledging something inevitable, something already in motion long before this moment began. And Brooks realized, too late, that he had never been in control of this encounter, not from the beginning, not even for a second. He had simply been standing at the center of something much larger, something that had now arrived to reveal itself, and the night, which had once felt like his ally, now stood as a witness instead, silent and unyielding as everything he believed about this moment began to unravel. The man who stepped forward did not raise his voice, did not rush, did not demand attention, and yet the entire space seemed to align around him as if the air itself recognized his authority before any words were spoken, his boots stopping just short of the edge of the streetlight, his figure outlined in a way that made every detail feel deliberate, every movement calculated. And Daniel Brooks felt it immediately, that quiet pressure that comes when presence alone shifts the rules of a moment, when control is no longer something you can claim, but something you realize has already been taken. And still he tried to hold his ground, shoulders tightening, voice preparing to assert itself again, to question, to challenge, to re-establish the order he believed he stood in. But before he could speak, the man's gaze settled on him with a focus so precise it silenced the words before they could form. And when he finally spoke, it was not loud, not aggressive, just clear, steady, and absolute, asking a single question that did not feel like a request but a confirmation. Is there a reason you have detained her? And the phrasing alone shifted something, not accusing, not defensive, but grounded in a certainty that assumed an answer would be required, not optional. And Brooks hesitated, just for a second, the kind of hesitation that does not show on the surface but echoes internally, because nothing about this exchange felt familiar anymore. Nothing about it followed the patterns he relied on. And yet he responded, explaining, justifying, trying to place the situation back into a structure he understood, describing suspicion, describing protocol, describing the need for clarification. But even as he spoke, the words felt thinner than they had moments before, less solid, less convincing, as if they were being measured against something unseen and found lacking. And the man listened without interruption, without reaction, his expression unchanged, his posture unwavering. And when Brooks finished, there was a pause, not long, but long enough to let the silence carry weight, long enough to make it clear that the explanation had not landed the way he intended. And then the man turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the woman still standing under the streetlight. And in that subtle motion there was recognition, not surprise, not curiosity, but recognition, as if her presence here was not a question to be answered but a fact already understood. And that was the moment it became undeniable, the shift that had been building from the beginning finally settling into place, because Brooks saw it now, not in words, not in actions, but in the way the space between them had changed, the way the focus of the moment had moved away from him entirely. And Ava Carter, who had remained still through all of it, finally exhaled softly, not in relief, not in tension, just a controlled release, like the closing of a chapter that had already reached its end. And when her eyes met his again, there was no challenge there, no anger, just something far more unsettling, a quiet understanding that this moment had never been about proving anything to him. It had simply been waiting for the truth to arrive, and now that it had, there was nothing left for him to hold on to except the realization that everything he thought he controlled had already slipped beyond his reach. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt decisive, as if something invisible had just been confirmed, and everyone present understood it without needing it spoken aloud. And Daniel Brooks stood there with the weight of that realization pressing down harder than any command ever could, because for the first time, he could not find the ground beneath his authority, could not locate the certainty that had carried him through countless encounters before this one, and the man in front of him did not move to escalate, did not raise his tone, did not even repeat his question. He simply waited, and that waiting carried more pressure than any demand, because it assumed an answer would come. It required it, and Brooks felt his response forming again. The same explanations, the same justifications, but this time they felt different before they even left his mouth. Thinner, less anchored, as if the moment itself no longer supported them. And when he spoke, there was a slight shift in his voice, almost imperceptible but real, a trace of hesitation where there had been none before. And the man listened again, his expression unchanged, his posture steady. But now there was something else in the air, something final approaching the surface, and it came not through volume but through clarity, through a statement delivered with precision. You will release her immediately. And the words did not sound like a suggestion. They did not carry negotiation. They simply existed as a fact. And for a brief second Brooks did not move, not because he did not understand, but because understanding it meant accepting something he had not yet fully processed, that the authority in this moment had never belonged to him, that the control he believed he held had been an illusion from the beginning. And his eyes shifted, almost instinctively, back to Ava Carter, and in that glance everything aligned, the calm, the silence, the patience, the subtle details he had ignored, all of it forming a picture that now made sense in a way it had not before. And she did not speak, did not need to. Her presence alone now carried a weight he could no longer dismiss, and slowly, without the confidence that had defined his earlier movements, Brooks stepped back, the distance between them widening by only a few inches but feeling far greater, as if a boundary had been redrawn without his consent. And his hand moved, not abruptly, not with force, but with a measured uncertainty as he corrected what had already been set in motion. And the moment that followed was not loud, not dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and irreversible, because once something shifts at its core, it does not return to what it was before. And as he stepped back fully, the space changed again, not with tension this time, but with resolution, the kind that settles after a truth has been revealed. And the man who had spoken gave a slight nod, not to Brooks, but to Ava, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than instruction. And she responded just as subtly, a small movement that carried understanding, rather than surprise. And in that exchange, Brooks saw clearly what he had missed from the start. This was never a random encounter, never an uncertain situation. It had always been something defined, something structured beyond his awareness. And he had simply stepped into it without realizing the role he would play. And now that role had reached its end, leaving him standing in the aftermath of a moment he could no longer control, watching as the balance of power settled firmly where it had always belonged. The shift did not end with compliance. It lingered, settling into every corner of the quiet street, as if the night itself had absorbed what had just happened. And Daniel Brooks stood there with his hands now empty of authority, not because anything had been taken from him physically, but because something far more significant had been removed without resistance, without argument, simply by the presence of a truth he could not override. And the man who had stepped forward did not look at him again, did not acknowledge him further, as if his role in the moment had already concluded, as if there was nothing left to address. And that absence of attention felt heavier than confrontation ever could, because it made clear that Brooks was no longer central to anything unfolding. He had been reduced from decision-maker to observer in a matter of seconds, and Ava Carter finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a small step forward into the clearer light, her posture still, composed, her expression unchanged. But now there was no ambiguity surrounding her presence, no uncertainty to fill with assumptions, because everything about the moment had already clarified what words had not needed to say. And she adjusted her sleeve slightly, a simple motion that revealed the edge of a watch, not decorative, not casual, but precise, functional, the kind of detail that spoke to a life structured around discipline and purpose. And Brooks noticed it now, noticed all of it now. The details he had overlooked when he thought he understood what he was seeing. And the realization did not come as a sudden shock. It came as a slow, steady correction, like a lens coming into focus after being blurred for too long. And the weight of that correction settled into him with a quiet finality, because there was no way to return to the version of the moment he had believed in before, no way to reshape it into something that placed him back in control. And the vehicles remained where they were, engines low, lights steady, the figures beside them still and attentive, not tense, not reactive, simply present, as if their role had always been to arrive at this exact point and no further. And Ava turned her head slightly toward the man who had spoken earlier, their eyes meeting for a brief second, an exchange that required no explanation, no confirmation, just mutual understanding. And then she looked back at Brooks, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more measured, a calm acknowledgement that carried neither judgment nor forgiveness, just clarity. And in that moment Brooks felt something shift inside himself, not defensiveness, not resistance, but something closer to awareness, the kind that comes too late to change what has already happened, but just in time to understand it. And he realized that the silence she had held from the beginning had never been weakness, never uncertainty. It had been control of a different kind, the kind that does not need to prove itself because it already knows where it stands. And the night, which had once felt like a space he could command, now felt like something else entirely, something that had witnessed the entire exchange without interference, without bias, simply allowing it to unfold until the truth revealed itself. And as the moment began to settle into stillness again, not the tense stillness from before, but a quieter, resolved kind, Brooks understood that nothing else needed to happen for this to be complete. No further words, no escalation, no correction, because the outcome had already been decided the moment he misread what stood in front of him. And now all that remained was the quiet echo of that realization, stretching into the night long after the encounter itself had ended. The moment did not end when the tension faded. It transformed, settling into a quieter rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar after everything that had unfolded. And Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, not because he had to, but because something inside him had not yet caught up with what had already happened, as if his mind was still trying to reconcile the version of reality he had carried into this encounter with the one now standing clearly in front of him. And the contrast between those two realities was not loud, not dramatic, but deeply unsettling, because it exposed something he had not questioned before, something that had always operated beneath the surface of his actions without needing to be examined. And now, under the weight of this moment, it refused to stay hidden, and Ava Carter did not rush to leave, did not turn away immediately as if eager to escape what had just occurred. Instead, she remained still for a few seconds longer, her presence grounded, her breathing steady, as if allowing the moment to fully settle before moving forward. And when she finally stepped away, it was with the same measured control she had carried from the beginning. No hesitation, no urgency, just a quiet continuation of something far larger than this single encounter, and the figures who had arrived. with that same calm precision, did not follow her closely, did not surround her or draw attention. They simply adjusted their positions in subtle coordination, maintaining a respectful distance that spoke not of protection alone, but of recognition, of hierarchy understood without being spoken, and Brooks watched it all unfold without interruption, his role now reduced to observation. His earlier certainty replaced by something more complex, something that did not resolve itself with a simple explanation. And as Ava moved past him, there was a brief moment where their paths aligned once more, not in confrontation, not in tension, but in proximity. And for a second, he considered speaking, considered offering something, an explanation, an acknowledgement, perhaps even an apology. But the words did not come, not because they were impossible, but because he understood, in a way he had not before, that this moment did not require them, that whatever needed to be revealed had already been revealed without them. And she did not look back as she continued forward, her focus already beyond the space they had shared, already returning to the path she had been on before he interrupted it, and the vehicles remained idling for a moment longer before beginning to shift, not all at once, not in a rush, but with the same controlled movement that had defined their arrival, each motion precise, intentional, and as they prepared to leave the street felt different again, not tense, not heavy, but quieter in a way that carried understanding rather than uncertainty. And Brooks stood there as the last of the vehicles pulled away, the low hum fading into the distance until the night returned to its original stillness. But it was not the same stillness as before. It carried something new now, something that lingered beneath the surface, a quiet reminder of how easily perception can shape reality and how quickly that reality can shift when confronted with truth. And as the red and blue lights from his own vehicle reflected faintly against the pavement, he realized that the moment had not just ended. It had left something behind, something that would not disappear with the fading sound of engines or the emptying of the street, something that would remain long after the night moved on, asking a question he could no longer ignore, not about what had happened, but about how it had happened, and why he had never seen it coming. The street returned to stillness, but Daniel Brooks did not move, not immediately, because something inside him refused to settle as quickly as the night around him, and the quiet that followed felt different now, not empty but reflective, like a mirror held up to a moment he could no longer replay the same way, and the flashing lights from his patrol car no longer felt like a symbol of control, they felt like a reminder, pulsing against the pavement in slow intervals, each reflection carrying the weight of what had just unfolded. And he exhaled slowly, not out of relief but out of recognition, because for the first time he began to see the moment not from where he had stood, but from a distance, as if stepping outside of himself and watching it play out again. And in that space the details became clearer, sharper, harder to ignore, the assumptions that had formed too quickly, the certainty that had come too easily, the way he had filled silence with judgment instead of understanding. And none of it had seemed unusual before, none of it had felt out of place, because it had always worked, always reinforced the version of reality he believed in. But now that same pattern looked different, exposed in a way that could not be undone, and he glanced down at his hands for a moment, as if expecting to find something there, some trace of the authority he had relied on. But there was nothing, just the quiet realization that authority without awareness is fragile, that it can disappear the moment it is placed against something stronger, something grounded in truth rather than assumption. And the night air felt cooler now, or maybe he was just more aware of it, more aware of everything. The faint sound of a car passing blocks away, the distant hum of the city continuing without pause, the way the streetlight above flickered once before stabilizing again. All of it grounding him in the present moment while his thoughts continued to circle what had already passed. And he looked down the road where the vehicles had disappeared, half expecting to still see them, to confirm that what had happened was real. But there was nothing there now, just darkness and distance, and that absence carried its own kind of finality, because it meant there was no more clarification coming, no explanation waiting to be given, no second chance to reshape the encounter into something else. It was complete exactly as it had happened, and the responsibility of understanding it rested entirely with him. And as he stood there, the question that formed was not loud, not dramatic, but steady and unavoidable, not about who she was, not about what authority she carried, but about himself, about the moment before everything shifted, about the choices made when he believed he was in control. And that question did not fade as the seconds passed. It settled deeper, anchoring itself in a way that suggested it would not be easily dismissed. And, for the first time, the badge on his chest did not feel like an answer. It felt like something that required one, something that demanded more than assumption, more than routine, more than the comfort of familiarity. And as the lights from his patrol car continued to pulse against the empty street, Brooks realized that the night had not simply witnessed what happened, it had revealed it. And now that it had, there was no returning to the version of himself that had stepped into that moment without question. Because once you see something clearly, truly clearly, you cannot pretend it was ever invisible. And that realization, quiet as it was, carried forward into the stillness, shaping what would come next in ways he could not yet fully understand, but could no longer ignore. The engine of his patrol car idled softly behind him, a steady mechanical rhythm that once felt grounding, but now only emphasized the stillness pressing in from every direction. And Daniel Brooks finally moved, not with urgency, not with purpose, but with the slow, deliberate steps of someone carrying more weight than they arrived with. His hand brushing lightly against the side of the car, as if reconnecting with something familiar, something predictable. And for a moment he simply stood there, staring at the reflection of the flashing lights across the hood, watching the red and blue distort across the metal surface like a signal he no longer fully understood. And the night stretched around him, unchanged and yet entirely different, because the difference was not in the street or the air or the silence. It was in him, in the way he now processed every detail, every memory of the encounter replaying not as justification but as evidence. And he leaned slightly against the car, exhaling slowly as his thoughts began to arrange themselves into something clearer, not comfortable, but undeniable, because it was no longer about what had happened. It was about what had been revealed in the process, and he could trace it back now, step by step. The moment he first saw her, the assumption that followed, the confidence that filled the gaps without question, and how easily it all fit into a pattern he had never challenged before. And that realization did not come with anger or defense. It came with something quieter, something more difficult to dismiss, because it was rooted in recognition, not accusation. And he glanced up at the empty road again, half expecting something to break the silence, a passing car, a voice on the radio, anything to interrupt the clarity settling into place. But nothing came, and that absence forced him to stay with the thought, to follow it further than he might have before. And he understood now that the moment had not been unpredictable. It had only felt that way because he had been operating within limits he did not see, boundaries shaped by assumptions he had never needed to question. And when those assumptions met something real, something grounded in truth, they did not hold. They collapsed quietly, leaving behind the space for something else to take their place. And that space was where he stood now, uncertain but aware, and the badge on his chest felt heavier than it had earlier, not physically, but in what it represented, because it was no longer just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of responsibility, of perception, of the weight carried in every decision made under its presence. And he reached up briefly, adjusting it without thinking, a small motion that felt different now, more intentional, more aware. And the radio crackled faintly, breaking the silence just enough to remind him that the world had not paused for this moment, that everything beyond this street continued as it always had. But he knew something had shifted regardless, something that would not simply fade with time or routine, because once a moment exposes a truth, it does not return to being unseen. And as he pushed himself off the car and stepped back toward the driver's side door, there was no dramatic resolution waiting, no immediate change to act upon, just a quiet understanding settling into place, shaping the way he would carry himself forward, not through force, not through correction alone, but through awareness, the kind that lingers, the kind that alters perspective in ways that are not visible from the outside but undeniable from within. And as he opened the door and paused for just a second before getting in, he looked once more at the empty stretch of road ahead, no longer seeing it as just another patrol route, but as something more complex, something that required more than routine, more than assumption, something that demanded attention in a way he had never fully given before. And with that thought lingering just beneath the surface, he finally stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him as the lights continued to pulse into the night. The patrol car door closed with a muted thud, sealing Daniel Brooks inside a space that felt smaller than it had just minutes before, the dashboard lights casting a soft glow across his face as he sat there without starting the engine, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping it, not moving, just there, as if he needed a moment to reconnect with something steady before continuing. And the radio murmured faintly in the background, dispatch voices drifting in and out, routine calls, routine responses, the steady rhythm of a system that moved forward regardless of what any one moment revealed. And yet for Brooks, the routine no longer felt automatic. It felt observed, as if each action now carried a weight he could not ignore. And he glanced at the rearview mirror, catching his own reflection briefly, not searching for anything specific, just noticing the stillness in his expression, the absence of the certainty that had been there earlier, replaced now by something quieter, something more deliberate. And he leaned back slightly in the seat, exhaling slowly as his thoughts continued to settle, not rushing, not resisting, just unfolding. And he understood that this was not a moment that demanded immediate answers. It was one that required time, reflection, the kind that does not resolve itself in a single realization but builds gradually, reshaping perspective piece by piece. And outside the windshield, the empty street stretched ahead, unchanged in appearance, but no longer simple in meaning, because now it carried context, depth, the memory of what had just occurred layered over its quiet surface. And Brooks reached for the radio instinctively, his hand pausing just before pressing the button, as if reconsidering the reflex itself, and then he lowered it again, choosing silence instead, not out of avoidance, but out of awareness. Because he realized that not every moment needed to be filled, not every pause needed to be broken, some needed to be felt fully before moving forward. And he looked once more down the road where Ava Carter had disappeared, not expecting to see her again, but acknowledging the direction she had taken, the path that had intersected with his for only a brief time, yet left a lasting imprint. And there was no resentment in that acknowledgement, no lingering tension, just clarity, the kind that comes when something is understood without needing to be explained. And he adjusted his posture slightly, his hands settling more firmly on the wheel now, not with the same confidence as before, but with a different kind of steadiness, one grounded not in assumption but in attention. And when he finally started the engine, the sound felt different, not louder, not softer, but more intentional, as if marking a transition rather than a continuation. And the headlights stretched forward across the pavement, illuminating the path ahead in a narrow beam. And as he shifted into drive, there was no dramatic change in the world around him, no visible sign that anything had shifted beyond this moment. But internally, something had, something subtle yet significant. And as the patrol car began to move, rolling slowly down the quiet street, Brooks carried that shift with him, not as a burden, but as a presence, a quiet awareness that would shape the way he saw what came next, the way he approached the unknown, the way he listened before acting. And the night, still calm and steady, offered no resistance, no commentary, just space for him to continue forward, differently than before. The patrol car moved steadily through the quiet streets, the tires rolling over asphalt that seemed unchanged yet carried a different weight now. And Daniel Brooks found himself noticing things he would have ignored before, the way a porch light flickered on in the distance, the silhouette of someone standing behind a window curtain, the faint movement of a stray newspaper shifting in the breeze. Small details that once blurred into the background, now standing out with unexpected clarity. And it was not because the world had changed, it was because his attention had, because something in him had slowed down enough to see rather than assume, to observe rather than conclude. And the rhythm of the drive felt different too, less automatic, more deliberate, each turn of the wheel measured, each glance at the road ahead carrying intention rather than habit. And he realized that the shift inside him was not dramatic, not something that would be visible to anyone watching from the outside, but it was real, and it was persistent, like a quiet recalibration taking place beneath the surface. And the radio crackled again, a dispatcher's voice calling out another situation a few blocks away, routine, ordinary, The kind of call he had responded to hundreds of times without hesitation, and his hand moved toward the radio again, instinctively. But this time he paused longer, not out of doubt, but out of consideration, as if he was allowing a new layer of thought to settle before acting, and then he responded, his voice steady, calm, but carrying a tone that felt slightly different even to him, less rushed, less reactive, more aware. And as he redirected the car toward the new location, the night unfolded ahead of him once more. Familiar streets stretching into the distance, yet no longer defined by assumption alone, and the memory of the encounter lingered, not as a distraction, but as a guide, shaping the way he processed what he saw, the way he approached the unknown, the way he chose his next words before they left his mouth. And somewhere in that quiet progression, there was an understanding forming, not fully complete, not neatly defined, but present, that authority without reflection is incomplete, that control without awareness is fragile, and that the difference between the two is not taught in a moment. It is realized through one, and he drove on, the steady hum of the engine blending into the rhythm of the city, carrying that realization forward with him, not as something heavy, not as something to resist, but as something to hold on to, something that would influence the choices yet to come. And as the next set of lights appeared in the distance, casting a soft glow across the road ahead, Brooks adjusted his grip on the wheel once more, not tightening, not loosening, just aligning, as if finding a balance he had not known he was missing. And the night, vast and quiet, offered no judgment, no interruption, just the space for that balance to take shape, one moment at a time. The road ahead opened wider as Daniel Brooks continued driving, the city gradually shifting from quiet residential blocks into streets touched by distant traffic and scattered movement. And yet the pace inside the car remained steady, unhurried, as if the night itself was allowing space for everything that had settled within him to fully take shape. And the earlier encounter no longer replayed as a sharp memory, but as something deeper, something integrated, a moment that no longer demanded attention yet continued to guide it. And he realized that change does not always arrive with noise or force. Sometimes it arrives quietly, reshaping how you see before you even recognize that anything has shifted at all. And as he approached the next intersection, the traffic light turned from red to green without hesitation. A simple transition, expected, ordinary. Yet it held a clarity that felt symbolic in a way he could not ignore, because movement forward does not erase what came before it, carries it, transforms it, and builds on it. And he eased the car through the intersection, the headlights cutting a clean path through the darkness ahead, illuminating just enough to continue, never revealing the entire road at once. And that limited view felt different now, no longer something to fill with assumption, but something to approach with attention, step by step, moment by moment. And he thought briefly of Ava Carter, not as a question, not as a mystery, but as a presence that had intersected his path at exactly the right time to reveal something he had not been looking for. And there was no need to see her again for that to remain true, because what she carried into that moment had already done its work, quietly, completely, without needing recognition or acknowledgement. And Brooks adjusted his focus back to the road, his posture steady, his movements aligned with a rhythm that felt more grounded than before, and the badge on his chest no longer felt like something to rely on without thought. It felt like something to carry with intention, something that required awareness to match its weight. And as the city lights stretched further into the distance, blending into the horizon, he understood that this night would not stand out to anyone else. It would not make headlines. It would not be remembered beyond those who were present. But for him it marked a line, not a break, not an end, but a shift, a point where perception changed direction, where understanding replaced assumption, and where control gave way to awareness. And the road continued, steady and open, offering no guarantees, no certainty, just the opportunity to move forward with a different perspective than before. And as the patrol car disappeared into the rhythm of the city, one thought settled quietly beneath everything else, not loud, not forced, but clear enough to remain. He had believed the badge gave him power over the night, but that night had shown him something else entirely. That true authority is not about control, it is about understanding, and the moment you lose that, the night will remind you who really holds the truth.